Emily and I needed a break from the routine. I, John, 34 years old and confined to a software engineer's cubicle, yearned for adventure. My brown hair was starting to show signs of age, but my blue eyes still held the sparkle Emily loved. She, at 32, had long blonde hair and green eyes that always shone with curiosity. As a literature teacher, her life was filled with stories, and we hoped this trip would become one of those unforgettable stories. We packed our bags quickly after dinner, and within a few hours, we were in the car, ready for a new adventure. The night was clear, the full moon illuminated the cloudless sky, and the gentle breeze brought a sense of freedom. We opted for a road that cut through the interior of the United States, promising beautiful landscapes and less traffic. The deserted and winding road seemed like a perfect choice. The smooth asphalt reflected the shine of the headlights, and the tall trees formed a natural tunnel around us. Country music played softly on the radio, filling the comfortable silence between us. Emily talked about the plans for the trip, the small towns we could visit, the local restaurants that might surprise us, and the old books she hoped to find at some fair. While driving, I focused on the road ahead. The gentle curves and the car's steady rhythm were almost hypnotic. Occasionally, I glanced at Emily, seeing her face illuminated by the dashboard light, her gaze lost in the nighttime scenery. The road seemed endless, but in a tranquil way. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the moon cast mysterious shadows among the trees. The sense of isolation was both comforting and slightly unsettling. We were far from everything, just the two of us, surrounded by the vastness of the night. After a few hours of driving, we decided to stop at a gas station to stretch our legs and refuel. It was there that a trucker mentioned a shortcut. "It'll save you at least an hour of travel," he assured, with a smile of someone who had traveled many roads. Back in the car, I brought up the idea of the shortcut. "What do you think, Emily? A quicker route, less traffic, maybe even more scenic?" She pondered for a moment, looking at the map on her phone. "Could be interesting. Besides, we're on an adventure trip, aren't we? Let's try it." With the decision made, we took the turn for the little-known shortcut. The road began to change almost immediately. The well-maintained asphalt gave way to a narrower and rougher track. The trees around us grew denser, their shadows lengthening and twisting under the headlights' glare. We continued driving, but the scenery around us seemed increasingly desolate. The winding road took us through tight curves and stretches that seemed to have never seen maintenance. I looked at Emily, who was now visibly tense, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. I checked the GPS, which showed the road as a thin, almost imperceptible line. "It's what the GPS indicates. We should reach our destination soon." But as we drove on, I started to feel a growing unease. More than once, I had the sensation of seeing something moving in the corner of my eye, only to disappear when I tried to focus. The isolation and desolation of the alternative road were palpable. And as we continued to drive, a feeling of discomfort began to set in. I couldn't help but wonder if we had made a mistake taking that shortcut, a decision that would lead us to experiences that challenged logic and our sanity. As we drove along the desolate road, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. Emily was quieter than usual, her green eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The dense vegetation around us seemed to swallow any trace of civilization, and the winding road stretched out like an endless corridor. The silence inside the car, once comfortable, now felt oppressive. That's when I began to notice something strange. At first glance, the landscape around was just a blur of trees and shadows. But as we drove on, I realized that certain points seemed to repeat. We passed a large oak tree with exposed roots, and a few minutes later, I saw another identical oak tree. At first, I thought it might be just a coincidence, but the repetition became increasingly evident. "Are you seeing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but unable to hide the tension. "Seeing what?" Emily replied, turning to me with a curious but tired expression. "These trees. It looks like we're passing the same place repeatedly." She frowned, looking out the window. "Maybe it's just our minds playing tricks. Trees can look very similar at night." I nodded, but the sense of déjà vu intensified. The radio, which had been emitting only a faint static for a while, began to make more disturbing noises. A high-pitched buzz came and went, followed by barely audible whispers, as if several people were talking at once. I turned the knob, trying to tune the station better, but the sounds only worsened. The buzz turned into a series of distorted noises that sent chills down my spine. Emily tried to change the station, but the result was the same: static and disturbing noises. "It must be interference," she said, but her voice betrayed an unease that mirrored mine. "Could be," I replied, trying to sound unconcerned. "Maybe it's better to turn off the radio for now." Agreeing, Emily turned off the device, leaving us in a silence that seemed even heavier than before. The sound of the tires on the rough asphalt was the only constant, but even that seemed strange, as if the road was leading us somewhere we shouldn't go. We kept driving, and the repetition of the landscape became even more disturbing. The same trees, the same curves, everything seemed to keep us trapped in an endless loop. The feeling that something was very wrong was impossible to ignore. "John, I think we need to get back to the main road," Emily finally suggested, her voice trembling. "I agree," I said, relieved that she had mentioned what I was also thinking. But when I tried to make a U-turn, the road seemed to conspire against us. Every attempt to find a turnaround point led us to more of the same repetitive scenery. "This doesn't make sense," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "How can we be going in circles?" Emily didn't respond, just looked at me with eyes full of fear and uncertainty. We were trapped in a place where logic seemed not to apply, and the line between reality and illusion was beginning to disintegrate. I continued driving, my heart beating faster with each mile. The night, once calm and clear, now felt like an oppressive entity, and the road, a prison without walls. And as we struggled to find a way out, something told me our nightmare was just beginning. The tension in the car was evident. Emily and I tried to stay calm, but each curve on the deserted road seemed to take us deeper into a nightmare. The repetition of the landscape was already disturbing enough, but then the apparitions began. The first shadowy figure appeared so quickly that I thought I had imagined it. A figure on the roadside, standing among the trees, briefly illuminated by the car's headlights. A shiver ran down my spine, and I instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter. I glanced at Emily, but she seemed not to have noticed. A few minutes later, I saw another figure. This time it was a clearer silhouette, a person standing at the roadside, looking directly at the car. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My heart raced, and I felt a chill spread through my body. "Did you see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Emily looked at me, confused. "See what?" "There was someone at the roadside," I replied, trying not to sound alarmist. "I'm sure of it." She frowned and looked out the window. "I didn't see anything. Maybe it's just your imagination. We're tired." I kept driving, but my mind was on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move. Every reflection in the headlights seemed to come to life. Then it happened again. A slim figure crossed the road quickly, visible for just a second before disappearing into the darkness. "My God, did you see that now?" I asked, my voice betraying my nervousness. This time, Emily had seen it too. Yes, I saw," she replied, her voice trembling. What was that? I don't know, I said, trying not to appear as scared as I felt. But I don't like this. We need to find a way off this road. I sped up the car, my eyes scanning the road and its edges for more of these apparitions. The figures kept appearing, always briefly, always at the roadside, as if they were watching us. With each apparition, my heart beat faster, and I felt the adrenaline rush through my body. Emily was becoming more and more frightened. John, what's happening? Why are we seeing these things? I don't know, I responded, trying to stay calm. But we need to get out of here as soon as possible. The radio, which was still off, began to emit static, as if it was trying to pick up a station. I looked at Emily, who was as pale as a sheet, her eyes wide with fear. John, this isn't right. This isn't right at all. I know, I said, my voice a tense whisper. I know. The figures kept appearing, always in the corners of our vision, always disappearing before we could look directly at them. Felt like we were being followed, watched by something we couldn't understand. Fear and paranoia were taking over, and every mile driven seemed to take us deeper into the unknown. Finally, I saw a more open area ahead, a small space where I could pull over. I stopped and turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. Emily and I took deep breaths, trying to calm our racing hearts. We have to get out of here, I said, my voice firm despite the fear. Somehow, we need to get back to the main road. Emily nodded, her eyes still wide with fear. Yes, we need to. As we sat there, in the middle of the deserted and winding road, surrounded by darkness and the shadowy figures that seemed to be watching us, I knew our journey had turned into something much more sinister. The road was alive, and we were its prisoners. And as the night wore on, the line between reality and illusion continued to disintegrate, leaving us at the mercy of our own deepest fears. Parked in the small open area, Emily and I tried to catch our breath. The silence around us was almost suffocating, and the darkness seemed to close in on us. The feeling of being watched didn't diminish, and the shadowy figures that briefly appeared at the roadside continued to haunt our thoughts. John, what are we going to do? Emily's voice trembled, reflecting the fear we both felt. We're going to try to get back to the main road, I replied, trying to stay calm. There has to be a way. She nodded, but the tension on her face was evident. I started the car again, and we began to drive back down the winding road. Every mile driven felt heavier, and the repetition of the landscape was maddening. Frustration began to build. Are you sure this is the right way? Emily asked, her voice full of doubt. Yes, I'm following the GPS, I replied, trying to hide my own uncertainty. But we're not getting anywhere. We're going in circles. I know that, Emily, I replied, the irritation starting to show. I'm doing my best, she sighed, crossing her arms and looking out the window. Maybe if you hadn't insisted on this shortcut, we wouldn't be in this situation. Her words hit me like a blow. You agreed to the shortcut, I retorted, feeling the anger bubble up. It was a joint decision. Yes, but you always want to take shortcuts, always want the quickest option, without thinking about the consequences. Oh, and you're perfect, aren't you? Never make wrong decisions. The words came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't control myself. Emily was silent for a moment, her eyes shining with tears. I just wanted a peaceful trip, John. Something to take us away from all this. And now we're stuck on this damned road, seeing things we can't explain. I sighed, feeling the guilt and regret weigh on me. I'm sorry, Emily. I wanted it to be different too, but we need to work together to get out of this. She nodded, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her shirt. Yes, together. But the tension between us didn't diminish. Each time the landscape repeated, each time a shadowy figure appeared at the roadside, the frustration and fear grew. The radio, which remained off, seemed to echo our own mutual distrust. "Do you think this is real?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice almost a whisper. "Or are we going crazy?" "I don't know," I replied, the sincerity in my voice reflecting my own despair. "But we need to keep our heads cool. We'll find a way out." She looked at me, her green eyes searching for some certainty in mine. "I hope you're right." We continued driving, but with each mile the tension grew. Small arguments turned into big fights, mutual distrust growing with each ghostly apparition. Felt like the road was playing with us, testing our limits. And amid all this, the feeling of being watched never left us. The night wore on slowly, and the line between reality and illusion continued to disintegrate. Emily and I were trapped not only on the road, but also in a cycle of fear and frustration that threatened to destroy us. With each curve, hope diminished, and the deserted and winding road seemed more and more like a labyrinth with no way out. We decided on one more attempt to get back to the main road, but every attempt seemed in vain. The road, once merely winding and deserted, now seemed like a labyrinth conspiring against us. Every curve, every attempt at a turnaround led us back to the same point. The repetition of the landscape, with its tall trees and unsettling shadows, became an oppressive presence surrounding us on all sides. "Let's try again," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The GPS was practically useless, showing only the same thin, winding line with no indication of progress. "We must be making some mistake." Emily sighed beside me, the exhaustion evident in her eyes. "I don't know if I can take this anymore, John. It feels like we're stuck in a nightmare." "We'll get out of this," I replied, trying to convey confidence. "We just need to find the right way out." But as we drove, the road seemed to stretch indefinitely, and despair began to set in. Each turnaround led to the same scenery: the large oak with its skeletal roots, the shadowy figures that appeared and disappeared at the roadside, the disturbing static that occasionally echoed from the turned-off radio. It was as if we were being pulled back by an invisible force. "I don't understand," I murmured, more to myself than to Emily. "We're following the same path, but we never get out." "Maybe this road doesn't want us to leave," Emily said, her voice trembling, "like it's keeping us here on purpose." The idea was terrifying, but it couldn't be dismissed. Every attempt to find an escape route resulted in the same destination: a return to the starting point. The claustrophobia increased, and the car, once a refuge, now felt like a mobile prison. "Let's stop again," I suggested, feeling the weight of despair on my shoulders. "We need to think of another strategy." I pulled over and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening, and the darkness around us seemed to close in even more. Emily and I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the gravity of our situation. "John, I'm scared," she finally said, her voice a whisper. "What if we can't get out of here?" "We will," I responded, though my words sounded hollow even to me. We need to think of another way." "What other way?" Emily asked, frustration and fear mingling in her voice. "We've tried everything." I looked at her, trying to find some answer in her eyes, but all I saw was the reflection of my own despair. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the invisible wall of despair closing in around us. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own dark thoughts. The road, with its ghostly figures and repetitive landscape, felt like an endless loop, a trap that was closing tighter and tighter. Finally, I decided to try something different. "Let's turn off the GPS," I suggested. Maybe, just maybe, we're relying too much on technology and not enough on our instincts. Let's try to remember the way back without it. Emily reluctantly agreed, and I turned off the GPS, feeling a mix of hope and despair. I started the engine again, and we began to drive, trying to use memory and instinct to find our way back. But the road seemed to play with us. Every curve seemed familiar, every landmark an echo of what we had already seen. The sense of despair grew with each mile, and the claustrophobia was almost unbearable. The fear that we would never get out of this road became a reality. As we drove on, the night seemed to grow denser, and the shadows around us more oppressive. The line between reality and illusion continued to disintegrate, leaving us at the mercy of our own fears. And as hope dwindled, despair set in, turning the deserted and winding road into an endless nightmare from which we couldn't escape. We kept driving, but with each mile traveled, disorientation increased. The road, initially just winding, now felt like a labyrinth with no exit. Every attempt to turn back, every attempt to find a new route led us back to the same starting point. The despair was palpable, and the silence between Emily and me grew heavier and heavier. "John, I don't know if I can take this anymore," Emily said, her voice trembling with fear. "It feels like we're trapped in an endless nightmare." "I know," I responded, trying to hide my own despair. "But we need to stay calm. We'll find a way out." But the words sounded hollow. The feeling that we were trapped in an endless cycle was overwhelming. Every curve on the road, every repetitive landmark, all contributed to a growing sense of disorientation. I began to doubt my own perception of reality. And, by the look in Emily's eyes, she was struggling with the same feelings. "None of this makes sense," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "How can we be driving for so long and not have moved? Do you think we're going crazy?" Emily asked, her voice full of despair. "Maybe all this is just our mind playing tricks." I looked at her, her green eyes shining with fear and uncertainty. "I don't know, Emily. None of this seems real. But at the same time, everything is so vivid." The radio, which was off, began to emit static, as if it was trying to pick up a station. I looked at Emily, who was becoming paler and paler. "John, this isn't right. None of this is right." I turned the radio off completely, trying to ignore the disturbing sounds that continued to echo in my mind. With each mile traveled, the line between reality and illusion became thinner. The ghostly figures continued to appear at the roadside, brief glimpses of something inexplicable, something that defied logic. "We need to stop," I said, my voice firm despite the fear. "We need to get out of the car and try to understand what's happening." Emily reluctantly agreed, and I stopped the car again, this time in a small clearing. We got out of the car, the cold night air wrapping around us like a cloak. The road was deserted, and the silence around us was almost deafening. "What are we going to do now?" Emily asked, her voice a whisper. "We're lost, John. Completely lost. We need to stay calm," I said, trying to control the rising panic within me. "Let's try to remember the way back. We need to trust our instincts." But as we looked around, the disorientation increased. Everything looked the same, every tree, every curve on the road. It was as if we were trapped in an endless cycle, a loop that kept us captive. And paranoia began to set in. Do you think this is some kind of trap?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Something or someone is keeping us here on purpose?" The idea was terrifying, but it couldn't be dismissed. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we need to keep trying. We can't give up." We got back into the car, the silence between us even more oppressive. I kept driving, but the disorientation and paranoia increased with each mile. I began to doubt everything: the road, the car, even reality itself. The shadowy figures, the disturbing sounds, all contributed to a growing sense that we were on the brink of madness. Emily was becoming more and more distant, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but she seemed to be looking at something far beyond. "John, I don't know if I can go on," she said, her voice a whisper almost inaudible. "We need to keep going," I responded, my own voice a distant echo. "We'll get out of this. Somehow we'll find a way out." But as the night wore on, hope dwindled. The deserted and winding road felt like a labyrinth with no exit, a nightmare that kept us captive in an endless cycle of despair and paranoia. The road seemed to have a spirit of its own, an evil entity that fed on our despair. The disorientation and paranoia had already pushed us to the limit, and now the supernatural events began to intensify in a way that defied any rational understanding. We drove in silence, both lost in our dark thoughts, when a deafening sound of twisted metal echoed from the radio, which was off. Emily jumped, her eyes wide with terror. "John, what was that?" she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Before I could respond, the static on the radio turned into a series of whispering voices, mixed with high-pitched screams. I turned off the radio, but the sounds continued, now echoing inside our own minds, as if the road was invading our thoughts. "They are here," one of the voices whispered clearly, and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked at Emily, her face pale and eyes filled with fear. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I knew the answer. She nodded, unable to speak, her breathing rapid and shallow. The road, once deserted, now seemed alive, pulsating with a dark energy. The ghostly figures that appeared at the roadside were closer, their empty eyes fixed on us, as if they were watching and waiting. Suddenly, one of these figures jumped in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from where the figure had appeared. But when we looked, there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness and shadows dancing in the headlights' glow. "This is getting worse," Emily murmured, her hands trembling. "Much worse." The road seemed to conspire against us, the shadowy figures becoming more aggressive, appearing in front of us, trying to force us to stop. Every time one of these figures appeared, we felt a wave of pure terror, a sense that something evil was surrounding us. We kept driving, but the fear was unbearable. The voices on the radio turned into screams of agony, and the ghostly figures began to hit the car, their faces distorted by rage and despair. Emily was crying now, her hands gripping the seat tightly. "John, we have to get out of here. We have to get out now," she screamed, her voice full of panic. "I know," I screamed back, my own voice trembling. "I'm trying." But the road seemed to stretch indefinitely, each mile bringing more terror. The shadowy figures were now following us, running alongside the car, their horrifically disfigured faces illuminated by the headlights. Their ghostly hands scratched at the windows, trying to get in. "This isn't real. This isn't real," I murmured to myself, trying to stay sane. But each scratch, each scream, each shadowy figure was a terrifying reminder that we were trapped in a nightmare from which we couldn't wake up. Suddenly, the car gave a violent jolt, as if it had hit something. I stopped again, my heart pounding wildly. I got out of the car. The darkness around us seemed to swallow everything. I looked around, trying to find some explanation, but the road was empty. "John, get back in the car," Emily screamed, her voice full of fear. "Don't go out." But before I could respond, I saw something in the distance. A figure larger and more imposing than the others was standing in the middle of the road. Its eyes glowed with a cold, inhuman light, and a macabre smile distorted its face. I quickly got back in the car, locking the doors. "We need to get out of here now," I said, my voice trembling. "No matter what, we need to leave." But as we drove, the imposing figure began to move, following us with supernatural speed. The other figures joined it, surrounding the car, hitting the windows, trying to get in. The road, once just a deserted and winding path, was now a battlefield against forces we couldn't understand. The terror inside the car was palpable, and each mile traveled felt like an eternity. The shadowy figures were closer than ever, and the sense of despair increased with each second. Emily and I were on the brink of madness, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and paranoia, with no way out in sight. As we continued driving on the oppressive road, the tension and fear began to bring out our deepest secrets and fears. Each mile traveled seemed to open doors that had long been locked in our minds. The imposing figure still followed us, its shadowy forms almost tangible in the rearview mirror. The hits on the car windows and the screams of agony seemed like echoes of our own dark thoughts. Emily was curled up in the seat, her silent tears affecting me more deeply than any terror outside. "John," she suddenly whispered, breaking the tense silence. "I have to tell you something." I looked at her quickly but kept my eyes on the road. "What, Emily?" I haven't been entirely honest with you," she said, her voice full of regret. "There's something I've been holding back for a long time." The dread in her voice was unmistakable. "What is it?" I asked, trying to hide my own fear. "There was a time before we got married when I was involved with someone," she confessed, her words coming out in sobs. "It was a mistake, but I never told you because I was afraid of losing you." The revelation hit me like a blow. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was so afraid you would hate me," she replied, her tears falling freely now. "I thought I could bury it, that I would never need to reveal it. But now, with everything that's happening, I feel like I can't hide anymore." I remained silent, processing the information. The road seemed to respond to our despair, the shadowy figures becoming more aggressive, as if feeding on our pain. "John," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "What are you hiding? What's haunting you?" My heart pounded in my chest. I also had secrets, fears that had haunted me for years. "There's something I never told you," I began, my voice trembling. "Before we met, I had an accident. Car accident. I killed someone." Emily looked at me, her eyes wide. "What?" "I was driving too fast, it was raining, and I lost control," I continued, my voice full of guilt. "I killed a person and never got over it. It's something that haunts me every day." The silence between us was heavy, full of confessions and regrets. The road seemed to react to our deepest fears, the shadowy figures now almost touching the car, their faces distorted by a rage that mirrored our own pain. Then something unexpected happened. In the distance, we saw a familiar glow, a neon sign that seemed out of place on that dark road. It was the sign of the motel where we had stopped the night before. This can't be real," I murmured, slowing the car. "Are we going in circles?" "It can't be," Emily replied, her gaze fixed on the sign. "It's like the road is playing with us." I approached the sign, and the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. We got out of the car and approached cautiously. The sign flickered intermittently, and next to it was an old roadside marker, something I hadn't noticed before. "John, look at this," Emily said, pointing to the marker. "This wasn't here before." The roadside marker was covered in ancient inscriptions, symbols we didn't recognize. But at the center was something familiar, a pocket watch I had lost years ago. I picked up the watch with trembling hands, and the feeling of despair and terror increased. "This is not possible," I murmured, feeling reality crumble around me. "This was my grandfather's. I lost this years ago." Emily looked at me, her eyes full of fear. "John, I think this road, it's playing with our memories. It knows what scares us." The road wasn't just a path, but a conscious entity that fed on our deepest fears. The shadowy figures, the disturbing visions, everything was a cruel manipulation of our minds. We were trapped in a cycle of terror that fed on our secrets and fears. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice firm despite the panic. "Somehow, we need to escape this entity, this cursed road." Emily nodded, her eyes still full of tears. "Yes, let's find a way." As we got back in the car, the sense of despair was overwhelming, but now there was a new determination. The road might be a conscious entity, an evil force that fed on our fears, but we wouldn't let it destroy us. Together, we would fight to find a way out, to escape this endless nightmare. We knew the road wasn't just a path, but a conscious entity that fed on our deepest fears. And to escape, we would need to confront the most powerful manifestation of this entity. We kept driving, the tension in the car almost unbearable. The road, now an almost palpable presence, seemed to pulsate with an evil energy. The shadowy figures, once distant shadows, were now closer, almost tangible. The disturbing whispers and screams on the radio intensified, mixing with the sound of tires on the rough asphalt. Then, ahead, we saw something that made us freeze. A huge, shadowy figure blocked the road. Its eyes glowed with a cold, inhuman light, and its macabre smile seemed to mock our attempt to escape. This was not a simple apparition. It was the most powerful manifestation of the road, the very essence of the entity that kept us captive. I stopped the car, the engine still running low, and looked at Emily. "We need to face this," I said, trying to keep my voice firm. "How?" she asked, the fear evident in her eyes. "How do we face something we don't even know what it is?" "I don't know," I replied, getting out of the car. "But we need to try." Emily followed me, and together we walked towards the shadowy figure. Each step was heavy, as if the road was trying to pull us back. When we were a few meters from the figure, it began to speak, its voice a distorted echo that reverberated in our minds. "You think you can escape?" the figure mocked. "I am the road. I am your fears, your secrets, your pains. You can never leave me. Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why do you keep us here?" The figure laughed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. "I feed on your souls, on your deepest fears. Every mistake, every secret, every fear you have strengthens me. You are my prisoners, and I am your prison." Emily took a step forward, her voice firm despite the fear. "You can feed on our fears, but you can't break us. Not while we're together." The figure hesitated, and for a moment, I saw something like uncertainty in its glowing eyes. "You think love can conquer fear?" it mocked. "We'll see." Suddenly, the figure lunged at us, and the world around us distorted. We fell into an abyss of darkness, our minds flooded with visions of our worst nightmares. I saw the car accident that haunted my dreams, the bloodied body, and the overwhelming guilt. Emily was beside me, facing her own demons, her cries of despair echoing in the darkness. But in the midst of the chaos, I felt her hand in mine, a firm touch, an anchor in the storm. I looked at her, and despite the fear in her eyes, I saw determination too. "We're together," I said, my voice a whisper in the darkness. "We'll get through this together." With tremendous effort, we stood up. The darkness around us began to dissipate, replaced by the faint light of the car's headlights. The shadowy figure was weakened, its form wavering. "No!" the figure screamed, its voice full of rage and despair. "You cannot defeat me. You cannot separate us," Emily replied, her voice firm. "And as long as we're together, you can't win." With those words, the figure began to disintegrate, its shadows dissipating like mist in the wind. The road, once oppressive, now seemed less threatening. The entity that kept us captive was losing its power. But then, the figure revealed one last truth, a shocking revelation that left us stunned. "You have been here much longer than you think. The road hasn't imprisoned you just tonight. You have been here for years, reliving this endless cycle of fear and despair. Each attempt to escape, each new beginning, is just part of my game." Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. I looked at Emily, and I saw the same shock and despair in her eyes. "This can't be true," I murmured, trying to deny the reality that surrounded us. "But it is," the figure mocked, its form almost completely disintegrated. "You can never escape me. You are mine forever." With a final cry of defiance, the figure disappeared, leaving us alone on the silent road. The weight of the revelation crushed us, but at the same time, there was a new hope. The road no longer had the same power over us. The entity was weakened, and maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to escape this endless cycle. "John," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. "Let's find a way out. Together." I nodded, holding her hand tightly. "Yes, together. We'll beat this." We got back in the car again, and as we drove along the deserted road, we felt a new strength growing within us. The road was still there, still trying to trap us, but now we knew we could fight. And together, we would find a way to escape this eternal nightmare. With the disturbing revelation of the road still echoing in our minds, we knew our next step would be crucial. We were trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair, but now we had a chance, a small window of opportunity to break this cycle and reclaim our lives. We drove in silence, the road still winding and deserted, but now there was a determination in us that hadn't existed before. We needed to face our deepest fears, confront the truths that the road had used against us. "John, we need to understand how to break the cycle," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear. "There has to be a way." "Maybe," I replied, my thoughts spinning in my mind, "maybe we need to confront our fears, face them head-on." The road seemed to respond to our challenge, the shadows growing denser, and the screams on the radio louder. The shadowy figures began to reappear, but this time we didn't look away. We faced each vision with the firmness of those who know they have nothing to lose. "I need to go back to the place of the accident," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to face what happened." Emily nodded, holding my hand. "And I need to face what I did before we got married. We need to resolve this together." I drove the car to a point where a road branched off into a path that seemed familiar. I followed that path, guided by a mix of memory and instinct. The road opened up to a clearing, the site where the accident had occurred. I got out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. "This is it," I said, my voice echoing in the silent clearing. "This is where it all happened." Emily got out of the car and walked up to me. "Let's do this together." I closed my eyes and relived the accident, the torrential rain, the sound of the tires skidding, the terrible impact. I felt the guilt, the pain, the despair. But then, I opened my eyes and saw Emily beside me, feeling her presence like an anchor. We faced the past together, and slowly, the clearing around us began to change. The shadows receded, the air became less oppressive. "Now it's my turn," Emily said, her voice firm. "Let's go back to the motel where it all started." We got back in the car and followed the road, this time with a clear purpose. The road seemed to resist, the shadowy figures trying to divert us, but we remained steadfast. We reached the motel, and Emily got out of the car, looking at the flickering sign. "This was it," she said, her voice a whisper. "This was where I made my wrong choice." We walked to the room where we had stayed, and Emily closed her eyes, reliving her memories. I held her firmly, feeling her pain and regret. "You made a choice, but that doesn't define who you are now," I said, trying to comfort her. The road around us began to tremble, as if it was fighting against our resolution. But then, something changed. The shadowy figures began to disappear, the oppression lessened, and a sense of calm took over the place. "It's working," I murmured, feeling a renewed hope. "We're breaking the cycle." We got back in the car one last time, knowing that the next step would be decisive. I drove the car back to the main road, but this time with a sense of clarity. The shadowy figures were disappearing. The road seemed less threatening. "John, look," Emily said, pointing to the horizon. "The exit." In the distance, I saw a bright light, an opening in the darkness that surrounded us. I sped up the car, driving towards the light, feeling the road tremble beneath us. But we remained firm, guided by the hope of escape. We passed through the opening, the light blinding us for a moment. When our vision returned, we were on a familiar road, the sun beginning to rise on the horizon. The cursed road was behind us. Emily and I looked at each other, still processing what had happened. "We did it," I said, my voice full of relief. "We did it." But as we continued driving, we knew the experience had changed us forever. We had faced our deepest fears and survived. And now we had a new chance at life together. The road that had trapped us was behind us, but the scars would remain. And as the sun rose, we couldn't help but wonder if we had truly escaped completely. The living road, a conscious entity, might still be watching us, waiting for a moment of weakness. But for now, we were free, and that was enough. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe to the channel and watch more stories like this by clicking on the video that appears on the screen.